Material for the brain. Conversations for thinking bodies. In this show, together with our guests, we explore different ways in which we can develop a meaningful relationship with our bodies and minds and respond to the current state of the culture in a quest for more integrated and embodied perspectives. Hello and welcome to Material for the Brain podcast. This is Matan Levkovich. My guest for this episode is Christos Galanis, who is an interdisciplinary artist, cultural geographer, animist, and a ritual facilitator based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. His work weaves themes of displacements, ancestry, and the sacred, drawing from a rich tapestry of personal history, ethnography, and experiential practices. Christos earned a BFA in Integrated Music Studies from Concordia University in Montreal, an MFA in Art and Ecology from the University of New Mexico, and a PhD in Cultural Geography at the University of Edinburgh. Christos is a fourth generation of men in his family to emigrate from their country of birth, a lineage that profoundly influences his exploration of themes like displacement and belonging. In our conversation, we explored the meaning of animism as a lived framework rather than a nostalgic return to ancient belief. We talked about how Christos' identity as a first-generation Greek American informs his relationship to place, ancestry, and belonging. We talked about the philosophical shift from relational to categorical thinking found in modernity that prioritizes measurement over meaning. We discussed how indigenous animist perspective challenged the foundation of modern science, especially around knowledge, truth, and verification. We talked about the legacy of monotheism, the ideological drive for universality, and how Judaism stands apart as a practice-based tradition still deeply rooted in place. We talked about the entanglement of place, ritual, and identity, and how the loss of locality contributes to existential disconnection. We talked about political animism as a potential alternative to left-right paradigms, about grief as a doorway to transformation, and about the struggle to live ethically in a world that is built on disconnection. And now I bring you Christos Galanis. Hello, dear Christos. How are you, my friend?
Hi, Matan. I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, welcome to my show. It took us some time to arrive to that moment, but I'm very excited to host you here. So where do I catch you? Where are you right now? What is happening in your life?
Yeah, so I'm actually at home here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the United States. It's kind of a few hours from Mexico, from the Mexican border. And it's a Sunday here, and we're actually getting ready to run an underscore in a couple hours here in Santa Fe. We have a monthly underscore going on.
Is there like a big community there in Santa Fe of dancers, or?
Yeah, it's a pretty small city, and so we usually get 25 people or so. So it's actually a pretty good turnout for a place this small.
Yeah, it's a good number.
Yeah.
You said that this is kind of a deserty area, no?
Yeah, it's high desert. We're at 30 meters. We're at 7,000 feet. In the southern end of the Colorado Rockies, basically, of the Rocky Mountains. So it's desert, but it's not like sand dunes and things like that. It's kind of more small cactus and shrubs and not a lot of trees, but it's beautiful if you think of kind of a cowboy frontier kind of aesthetic. That's kind of what it's like here.
Yeah, I made a short road trip with my wife back in 2018, and that was kind of that was exactly the image I was expecting to see, these kind of cactuses and rocks, and I was kind of we drove from California to Boulder, Colorado, through the desert in Utah.
Yeah.
And I was kind of waiting for the moment that I'll see that kind of images. So yeah, it's kind of beautiful.
You'll probably find that in Arizona more, but I think we're a bit too high for that. I mean, it still gets hot here in the summer, but we have real winter with snow and everything like that. And it's the oldest history in the continental United States. The oldest church in the country is actually here from around 1609 or so. So there's a lot of the very earliest kind of Spanish history in the continental United States here. So it's a pretty beautiful place with a lot of mixed history.
Yeah, I'm sure we will dive on different things in that regard. So maybe I want to invite you to give the audience a brief overview of who you are, what you're doing, and you can take it to whatever direction that feels right for today, and kind of 5-7 minutes so that we know who you are.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's also depending what's going on in my life right now. Well, I know part of the reason we connected is around this question around animism, which is something that I identify with, that kind of took a long time for me to come to that understanding. So there can be a way that animism can be interchangeable with paganism or even indigeneity. And I choose animism because of its own usage in history. So paganism was a term that Christians, monotheists, came up for non-Christians. And so for me, that it's very loaded in terms of like where that definition comes from, because it kind of means to not be Christian. Indigeneity, I think, is more of a human-based identity. It really kind of differentiates between indigenous and non-indigenous people, and I wouldn't identify as indigenous, certainly not indigenous to here in North America. I'm the first generation born here. Both sides of my family came over from Greece originally, one generation ago. And animism, the term itself came around the turn of the century, kind of in religious studies, academic studies, when there was this theory that was developed of kind of like a developmental lineage of religions. And so the idea that like prehistoric peoples were like animists, as in they believed that everything was alive. And then you kind of have the Greeks and the idea of like kind of Greek gods and Greek thought, and then eventually monotheism. So it's the idea that kind of Christian European civilization is like
Wait, Christos,
pinnacle.
I'm sorry, I got a bit lost because I asked you to share with me a bit your background, and then we dive completely into animism,
Sure.
which I'm missing something here.
Yeah, maybe I can come roundabout.
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
No, it's a good question. So I think it's my own background is trying to make sense of this, essentially. Growing up in a Greek Orthodox household and an immigrant family, and spending a lot of time in school, in academia, trying to make sense of the world, of reality, and what actually makes the most sense, both from an intuitive kind of experience sense, but also an intellectual kind of historical context. And so I would say my background has been, almost 40 years now of kind of exploring this question of like what model of reality actually makes the most sense to me. And that's where I come to animism. And so, our connection is through the dance community, through contact improv, something that I came into about 25 years ago when I was living in Toronto. Then I moved to Montreal to do school. I studied music there and collaborated a lot with dancers, and never saw myself as a dancer, never thought, that would be my thing. And then got into the contact improv community, and then eventually moved to this dance retreat center, Earth Dance, in Western Massachusetts in the United States when I was 29, so almost 20 years ago. And that changed my life, partly in that it opened me to people from all over the world with all kinds of experiences and, stories, because it's an international retreat center. But also really gave me a practice, which is movement, to kind of explore a lot of these questions that I started sharing with you around paganism, animism, monotheism. I have this desire to understand. I think that's a big one. I've done 2 undergrads, a master's, a PhD, and I've been straddling the worlds between academia, actually grad school, and then kind of community and dance practice and art practice. In some ways, I don't feel at home in either. I was kind of bridging the two. Usually academics are way too disembodied for me, and usually artists and dancers are too disorganized and chaotic for me, to be honest. There's a way that I kind of like the rigor of academia, but with the experiential research of the arts.
That's another point that maybe kind of energetically connects between us, this sense of lack of belonging.
That's definitely one. Yeah.
Oh, but I can really identify with that, like whenever I'm in a scene that like from like kind of borrowing from Ken Wilber's 4-quadrant perspectives. So whenever I'm in a scene can be a practice, content improvisation. So of course it embeds in a certain culture, and there's certain norms and that dictates how to behave and how to be, and this also implies to which kind of experiences we will have. And I always find myself noticing that which is missing, that is important for me, and not feeling at home. And I think that it's an interesting place to be, because it pulls towards integration and towards wandering, and wandering kind of pulls towards integration and assimilation of different perspectives. So
maybe I can bring it back to place, because I think that's going to be a central topic in our conversation. I never heard of New Mexico before 2010. I was looking at going back to school for a master's, and there was a program out here that was just starting. It was literally the first year, called Art and Ecology. It was a Master's of Fine Art. And the idea was art with ecology, interacting with the land, with place. And I was lit up in a way I hadn't been before. Just the idea, because I don't make objects. I'm not an artist in the traditional sense. It's more relational practice, relating with place through ceremony, ritual. And I moved out here and quickly, dove into the history of here and found that this was the edge of the Spanish Empire. Kind of, if you think of like Mexico, kind of the center of the Spanish Empire over here, this is the most northern edge of that. And because of that, a lot of like converted Jews or secretly Jewish converts actually were the first ones to come up into this area in trying to escape the Inquisition in Mexico, the Catholic Inquisition. So this is only coming out the last 10, 20 years where people are doing their DNA tests and realizing that they actually have Jewish ancestry. So there's something for me, this question of home and return, and that I'm always drawn to these places that are kind of on the edge and not, like it's not fully empire, and it's not fully wilderness, but there's something about these edges where you cannot fit in, but at the same time, you also don't belong, because it's a place in the world that people are drawn to that don't fit in. And that's kind of, that's the community here. I've heard the idea that it's the black sheep of their families that are drawn to Santa Fe. There's a lot of that here, people that have left home, kind of trying to find chosen family. And so I'm curious, just questions of home. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world right now, politically and culturally, around, who belongs and things like this, boundaries and borders. And I think I've always been drawn to the edges, these places that kind of straddle and bridge multiple identities, multiple histories.
Yeah, there's a lot with already what you're sharing. Okay, so maybe can we go back to what you started to develop before, to explore more what does the perspective animism entails for you? Because of course I know the word, but I'm curious to understand what does it mean in practice, and in particular, what does it mean for you?
Yeah. So I think the word itself, etymologically, is rooted to anima, which is almost, I think, synonymous with soul. So in some ways, it's the idea that everything is ensouled, everything has soul. So the phone I'm talking on right now, the trees outside, the river, the mountains, everything is a manifestation of consciousness, and each thing has a soul. But for me, that's a very, again, Christian idea, this discrete soul that, each being has a soul. For me, it basically came down to proceeding in the world as if everything has personhood. So if we think of what we think of as a person, which means not only consciousness and like awareness, but also the capacity to communicate in some way, like volition of some kind, that there's some kind of desiring and intent in all things. And we can get really metaphysical, whether like to what scale, macro or micro, you want to go to. But at its most simple form, it's that like the universe is composed of beings that are all negotiating life. And I think for me, it's almost a very consent-based model. So the idea that if you need something from the world, let's say I need to go chop down a tree or trees to make a home, you actually go out, you try to get permission, you actually like relate with the trees beforehand, you give some kind of offering, you give some kind of reciprocity, and then you continue to give thanks, let's say for decades to the home and remember the trees that, gave their life. So in the same way, every time I eat, I give a blessing for the beings that are dying or have died for me to live another day. So for me, it actually, there's a lot of overlap with actually polyamory culture and just like centralizing of consent and negotiation. And I think what happens in monotheism, this transition from animism or paganism, is the idea that nothing other than humans have consciousness or soul, and therefore there's nothing at the other end that you need to negotiate with. So it's almost an antidote to human supremacism, I would say, as well in our culture.
Yeah, it's I think it's interesting to first. I'm just kind of pulling into different direction. First of all, I heard recently a conversation between Sam Harris and his wife about that like there's more and more research, or let's say that there's a more scientific perspective that hypothesize that conscious is fundamental, that everything is manifestation of consciousness. So in a way, it's like science maybe found a way to eventually get back into that perspective, and nevertheless, even though that within that perspective there is let's say respect for all living beings, as far as I'm aware, this perspective didn't bring peace to the world. There was still conflicts.
Okay.
And I'm thinking that like if you think about like what you mentioned now, kind of monotheism and how we are kind of we moved from that model into something that centers humanity. I'm wondering if bringing back those archaic tradition now has a potential for a more complex synthesis, or you are really trying to move away completely from everything that was built, let's say, culturally. So I wonder, what does it mean to hold that perspective in a world where we know exactly on a material level why your phone is sending this electronic signal that enables us to communicate? So, and when you gave the first example of everything has consciousness or everything has a soul, and then you started by saying my phone, and then said the rivers, the trees, and of course, obviously, in a romantic perspective, I can go out to nature and see like, oh my God, the river is alive.
Right.
But when I'm holding, I don't know, like some kind of a piece of trash of old cables that I want to throw away, I cannot feel it's alive. So what does it mean, or how do you negotiate that tension? Because I'm sorry, it's a long question, but
no, it's a great question.
Because I think that like if I'm thinking about like the relation between technology and perspectives and like what informs our way of being, I can imagine that if I would have been alive thousands of years ago without any intellectual knowledge of how things work, so to speak. So of course, if you look at the sky and there is a rainbow, you would think like, oh my God, there's some living thing is decorating the sky here. Why would I think about, these ray of lights are breaking, like.
Right.
So like how to make a synthesis between those really different perspectives, if at all?
No, it's a really great question. And this, I think it's a good example. The question itself is a really good example. And there's two ways I can go. One is, you brought up modernity, and I'm fascinated by the transition into modernity, starting from around the 1400s, at least within European culture. Between 1400 and 1600, there's a lot that happens that, you can get into kind of science and technology studies. I'll start with the other one, which is a paper I was reading. It's a ethnographer, so someone who studies culture, who is walking with an Ojibwe elder. Ojibwe is I believe it's Canadian, kind of Western Canadian native tribe. And he asks him this question, like, what is alive and what is not? Are trees alive or are rocks alive? And the elder looks around and he says, well, that rock over there, that's alive, and that one is, but that one's not, and that one's not, and that one not really, and that one is. And of course, the researcher coming from like a modern Eurocentric paradigm is just like, how can one rock be alive and the other not? And the elder answers that it's not about categories, it's about what turns towards you. So this idea that one rock, for whatever reason, might turn toward you, might have some kind of impulse within its own consciousness to kind of connect with you, and other rocks might not. And so in that way, you're actually centering relationship as ontology being the study of what is, rather than taxonomy, rather than categories. And there's everything about modernity is categories. It's taxonomy, right? This is kind of how modern science begins. It's putting everything in containers, separating them into their discrete categories, and you can study them in isolation. So the question of what is alive is essentially everything has the capacity to be alive, the potential to be alive, but aliveness happens in relationship. And so in that way, there's also just like nested coherences, like the more complex, the accumulation of like consciousnesses, let's say, like if you think of plants, for example, how ancient they are and how much they've evolved to this planet. I mean, there's so much information there. Whereas when I think of my phone, yeah, maybe my phone has the capacity for aliveness or for relating, but I don't know how much a phone at this point, being only a few decades old, has much capacity for relating, based on its own experience. It doesn't mean that it's not conscious, if everything is conscious, but it's almost like there's a topography of aliveness that comes in through relationship.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it feels like as if the fundamental shift that you are pointing out leads to kind of a hint of what do we pay attention to? Do we pay attention to relation, which is an intersubjective thing, or do we relate to objects or subject and their physical appearance and things we can measure?
Right.
And for me, what is interesting is what is the relation between the two as well, because it's hard for me to imagine that categorization is a new phenomena in the sense of, because our brain has evolved to kind of have a simpler representation of complexity in order to be able to take decision. We have to know that, okay, this is fire, this is hot, this is water, yet we have definitely lost something in the maze of isolation. No question. Modernity and the trajectory that we are with this hyper-individualistic culture is, for me, it just makes everything dead. So, what do you think?
Yeah, there's yeah, we could go for a couple hours on this stuff. I mean, so something happened in Europe starting around the 1400s. It's about a 200-year period. There's a really great book called, I think it's the Measure of Reality, I think it is. And it looks at all these different areas of like everyday life where we transitioned from quality, like the quality of something, into quantity. So measurement. So one example is how in the past, each number that we use, 1, 2, 3, 7, 9, had a quality. A lot of it in Europe ended up being kind of entangled with Christianity. So 3 was like the Trinity, and perfection is all these kinds of things. But the holdover from that, at least in Western culture, is number 13. So the idea of 13 being unlucky, that even now in big apartment buildings, sometimes they don't have a 13th floor, like on the elevator buttons, it goes from 12 to 14. So that's an example that we can still experience of the idea of a number having a quality rather than an abstracted, purely categorical, like a number system, essentially. And there's also a linguistic quality that's really large in this, which I've traced a lot to. So in most indigenous cultures, there's still a foundation of relationality in the language. So for example, we say, a tree is a tree, a table is always a table, a chair is a chair. But in a relational language, you have a piece of wood and you have one word for it when it's a tree. And then when you carve it into a chair, it becomes another word. And then when you put that chair in the fire, it becomes the word for the thing that burns in the fire. So there's this way that it's not, you're always describing the relationship. You're not describing something as having this eternal identity, this fixed beingness.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because, I think, my father is a farmer and he's also, what's the name? Agronome, study agronomy. And yeah.
Like studying agriculture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he has a lot of botanical knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's quite amazing to see that, whenever I go with him to nature, his way of sharing the excitement is by saying the different names of the things that he see. But I know that that's not where it touches him. It's not that he's excited because he now saw red bougainvillea. It's not what makes him excited. Something touches him because he's been doing it for years and it's part of his soul.
Right.
But this layer is also there. And for me, sometimes it's almost feel as if this layer interferes with experiencing.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a utility for it, like when I want to grow, when I'm debating where if I should plant this tree in my balcony and would it survive the winter, then there's a strong utility for knowing that this is like a winter hard lemon type and not
right.
So yeah, it's a bit it's interesting for me, like what does it mean to borrow from that relational perspective in a way that is meaningful, because I don't think that it doesn't seem to me, at least on now, that you're rejecting taxonomical approaches to reality, but that there is something that deeper that calls you in that. Is that correct? Or
yeah, and I think maybe this is also another place where we resonate. Like, remember I was in a relationship with someone. I was living here. She was in the Bay Area, California, and I went out to visit. We went out to Marin County, north of San Francisco, for a hike, and it was beautiful, kind of overlooking the sea. And we're walking, and she kept saying, "Oh, that's a this plant that's good for this. Oh, that's a this plant that's good for this, and that's this plant." And eventually, I was like, "Can you stop?" He's like categorizing everything. Like, I can't actually like focus or just be here. Like when you keep giving all these unsolicited categories of all these things. And she got really upset and was like, but that's how like I want to connect. That's how I connect with nature. Like I've learned, all the different plants and what they do and, what they give. And I was like, this is the opposite. Like this takes me out of the place. Like I can't approach. And we got into a huge fight. Eventually, we figured it out and just realized, yeah, we have very different ways of relating and what's important. So I don't want to say it's bad. Like you said, there's obviously a place for navigating reality where we have to make distinctions between things, right? Someone is a friend, someone is an enemy. This is dangerous. This is safe. We're always making these distinctions, but there's a place that number comes in through Greek philosophy and monotheism, which actually relates a lot to contact improv for me, if you want to potentially go there. This idea of pure physics, I think there's always kind of arguments within the community of like the principles of contact improv and just laws of physics, gravity. I'm not I hate science. Like I said that appropriately. No, but like there's these mathematical equations, these laws of the universe. And I think with Steve Paxton and the founders, there was a lot of, minimalism, this idea of reducing, really just exploring these almost mathematical principles of movement and forces. And I've always been critical of that because it assumes that there's no place from which these relationships are happening, if that makes sense. These are just floating, algorithms, equations that apply everywhere, in Vienna, in Santa Fe, in China, on a mountain under sea. And I think what's happened in the dance community, let's say, is people that have the desire to, explore power in that, explore knowledge production in that, explore identity in that, explore chemistry in that. But that idea of a placelessness, as far as I can trace, goes back to monotheism, early ancient Greek culture as well. And this idea of like being everywhere and nowhere at the same time, this idea that knowledge can be produced and reproduced without any context, without being rooted in any relationship or place, right? So I'll give you one like solid example of like indigenous science versus modern European science is the question of verification. So how do you know that something is true? So in modern science, what we consider to be true is reproduction, the idea that you can do an experiment there in Vienna, you publish the methodology. Here in Santa Fe, I followed the exact steps, I reproduce it, I get the same results. That means that it's true, right? Because it's the same everywhere and all time. Within a relational or animist approach to knowledge, that might look like you have a new technology, let's say the smartphone, the iPhone. And then especially elders will observe maybe for a year, maybe for 10 years, how that interacts with the culture, with the world. And if it nourishes life or if it actually diminishes life. If it nourishes life, then it's true. And if it diminishes life, then it's not true. So this idea, you can see like it's a completely different framework for what is truth, right? And yeah, I see that again, I think monotheism is the foundation for a lot of modernity, actually, even though people think that it was a schism from religion.
But isn't it's an interesting point you're making, and I'm curious to take it to contact improv and what you've mentioned, even though I'm also interested in many other things at the same time.
Yeah.
To talk to you. No, I mean, the first question that comes to my mind, and that's I think that's the difficult with the synthesis between those things is that of course if you take different bunch of elders, they would come to a different truth, obviously, and humans have the capacity to come up with horrible forms of truth. Now we can question whether, and that's a bit for me another big question, like when did we depart from indigeneity and started to have ideas that are not rooted in indigeneity? Right. Is modernity and the development of modernity in Europe is not indigenous knowledge in the sense that like, okay, that's how that culture developed its own perspective of right. What is true and valuable, because, maybe some people there did think that way of understanding truth will bring more good to the world. And I think that there is something very beautiful about this kind of the particularity of that I hear in that kind of anchoring the idea of knowledge in, okay, it has to be very particular. You have to experience it and to grapple with it for some time before you can feel into it.
Right.
But at the same time, how can that, like, then we are completely departing from the idea that we could ever develop a certain universal morality, move away from violence, tribalism, which is something that I'm definitely interested in grappling as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what those thoughts, how did you echo with you?
Yeah, I feel like we're at this like crossroads. There's a lot of places we can go. So I think you're bringing up morality, certainly, and also like truth. Like, what is truth? What is authority? How does anyone know what is true? I mean, yeah, the last 5 years since, COVID first hit, it's just been a crisis of authority for the most part, right? There's this question, and maybe this is, I think, again, depending where your kind of political, philosophical leanings are, that could be progress in terms of postmodernism, this idea of like multiple truths, which I think was a way to try to decenter, European modern academic positions, and to say, oh, but look, like there's multiple truths. There's, you have here, it's, I'm living where the Pueblo have always lived for thousands of years. The Pueblo people, they have their own culture, their own language, their own truth. And at the same time, you don't want to descend into moral relativism or just say everything is fine, everything just is. It's almost a kind of nihilism that there's no point, right? There's no meaning because everything just is. But I think we can look and say, like, I'm reading a book right now on the Nuremberg trials, the first time of some kind of legal threshold of like, what is a crime against humanity? What is just certain actions and behaviors that are just universally like to be condemned, just wrong, right? And the fact that I'm almost like, is that a good thing? The idea, like, I don't know if anyone's ever done that because it's always been relational, right? Like, and again, it's this question of like, how do you try to make categories out of morality when morality is always contextual, it's always relational? And yet, I think for most of us, there's a felt sense, and that could just be evolutionarily, as social beings, of like things that are just really wrong, things that are not supporting life.
Yeah.
And then it's the question, well, why do the gods allow for things that don't support life in a system of life?
Sometimes I think that like, like one way out of that for me with maybe relates to what you brought up with that animism tries to decenter like humans, is that when we think about life, the first association we might have, like let's say common association, is like, and that maybe relates to the Nuremberg trial model, is that life means humans again. Like, okay, like support life, it needs to support humans in a way that humans are not being harmed, that we don't do horrible things to one another.
Right.
And I have a friend who is, let's say, kind of anchored. He grew up as a not Orthodox, but like more religious based in Israel. That was his upbringing, and eventually he kind of moved away from became more secular. But he keeps on saying, yeah, but like we are also just some transitioning things, and human life, as much as it's particularly beautiful for me and I care for my kids, but who knows, maybe in several years, okay, like humanity, like anything else, will come to its end. We can kind of prolong it, we can kind of fight for it, but there's another form of life will appear, or maybe not, and the planet will continue. So like, okay, what is the significant, and why is the significant that we put on human life? And I don't know, I have my own experiences with also different Buddhist traditions, and kind of the evaluation of human consciousness as an access to the ultimate experience. So like, and now we are also touching on the possibilities of something that is of digital consciousness. So like there's so much things happening, right. And as you said, like this conversation opens to many directions. So I feel like that for me, maybe one thing that is kind of maybe important to bring up and give you some moment to reflect on is because the word indigeneity and indigenous knowledge, it's also it's also something that you really hear, let's say, within like what I would say as the culture war in America, where like it became almost like a woke term. But I don't feel at all that you're coming from that perspective. And so maybe you can kind of dive a little bit into this, especially as somebody, as you said, like you're first generation born in America. How do you understand the term indigeneity? And maybe it also links a little bit to the story of what made you arrive to a point that you see yourself as animist, somebody who was born in a very different cultural understanding.
Yeah, I can try. There's a lot there. I agree with you. There's a way that the term indigeneity has kind of, for the most part, been taken as a political term. I don't use it that way, but I know that most people, when they hear me use that word, they assume they know what I'm saying about it. If you look at legal precedent for what indigeneity is, it becomes really fascinating, and it betrays this kind of wordplay. So in the United Nations Charter, the Charter of Indigeneity, in the categories, one of them is literally people who have been colonized by Europeans. And this is the legal, in the United Nations, this is the legal framework of one of the many, it's not the only point, but it's like, it's like having a language that is tied to a place, all these different things. But this European body made a definition of indigeneity that says indigeneity is people that have been colonized by Europeans, which means, remember when I brought up this point of like knowledge being produced not from any particular place? It's the idea that Europe itself becomes disappeared in that definition, because by definition, indigeneity is something that Europeans do to other non-European peoples, and you're erasing the history. Basically, you can't be indigenous and European because indigeneity depends on a European position. And so a lot of my research, I did my PhD in Scotland, looking at the Scottish Highlands, was inter-European colonization. Colonization by Europeans to Europeans. Because by that definition, there's also other definitions within the United Kingdom where the language Gaelic, which is what the Celtic people of like Scotland, Ireland, and Wales spoke, that it is recognized as an indigenous language. Yet at the same hand, there's another legal framework that says that there are no indigenous people in the United Kingdom. Like that's a legal precedent. Legally, there is no such thing as an indigenous person in the United Kingdom, even though these people have been there for thousands of years and have never left.
It's super interesting, and I was not aware of that anecdote, because I think it's in a way, I see it as like that's the subtle progressive lean to racism, I would say, like that you separate yourself, you create a certain system in which you can separate yourself from the rule.
Yeah.
You're an exception of the rule, and in that way you can maintain a superior position, even though that you're attempting to decenter yourself and respect others, but you're still maintaining a superior position in which, even if the claim is, I do it, because I want to support others and bring them up, let's say. But I think that it's subtle, but I think that it's staining the water which we are swimming in. It's like, it's problematic. Yeah, sorry.
No, you're right on point. That's what I discovered. So when I, for a lot of my life, I was a hardcore progressive activist. I was in academia. All these terms, for the most part, academia is founded in a Marxist framework. And all these things felt very true to me. And when I first moved to Scotland in 2014, I came with that perspective. I was like, I'm moving to Europe. I'm going to decolonize, my work's all about decolonization, studying modernism in Britain and modern supremacism. And then I spent 10 years with that place, with the people there, with the histories there. And going back to your question a bit ago about indigeneity, I had an experience that I did not expect, which is why it seems to me it's so hard to break down this identity of human supremacism, because once I started considering for real that every tree had personhood, the river had personhood, everything I ate had personhood, whether I'm vegan or keto, like every single thing I eat has to die for me to live another day. What happened was the amount of grief that started flooding over me as I realized that everything else had just as much ancestry and life as me. And when you look at how we treat everything in modern culture, to be honest, I was like in bed for stretches. Like I couldn't function. It was just so overwhelming to start hearing the real impact of how I proceed in the world, how we proceed in the world. And at this point, I'm convinced that that's actually a lot of why many of us, including me, resist really proceeding with that framework, because it takes seriously and in an embodied way the impact and accountability that we have in order to live, because we can't live without killing. We have to eat every day, but yeah, like I don't think it's because we're shitty people. I don't think it's because we're bad people. I don't think Europeans are especially bad people. Like I think these things, developed the way they did, but this question of what does it take to relate to everything as if it has its own dignity, and yet you have to negotiate power in life and death and what you take and what you give back. It was the loneliest thing I've ever experienced. It was, it took my breath away to have to go to the grocery store, to have to drive my car, participating in this culture that I could like feel the texture of how much we're taking without, it's not even giving back, because we don't even imagine that there is anything to give back to. You know?
Yeah, it's giving back already requires a different perspective. Wow, like it's interesting because I feel like that there is something about a dance between life and death fundamentally.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, right now we are within a seismic conflict between cultures who value life and cultures who honor death within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about it, that in a way, like it's hard for me to say, because, like one part of me is like full of anger, and I'm sorry, we talked before, and you were mentioning if we might dive into that topic, so I'm kind of giving myself the freedom to go there.
Yeah.
So on one hand, like I cannot at all, like, like my tribal part looks at everything that has started this cycle of violence from the Hamas militant, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, these are servant of demonic energy, like that's kind of the first impulse that I have on those days. I really felt, like, oh my God, there's really an expression of like darkness that it can be manifested through humans.
Yeah.
And now a year and a half after this whole violence keeps going on, like I started to look at it as kind of a dance, like that kind of certain culture really like value the afterlife. Like there's nothing meaningful here to achieve, and everything we do is like just about the moment we will departure from this life. And other culture, like Jewish culture, like really value, like every, like you say, like in Judaism, that like saving one person is like saving an entire universe. So life has a lot of value, and like, but in the act of participating in life, you're constantly, as you say, in a dance between life and death. Things are dying physically in us, and things are reborn, and we have to take other living entities in order to sustain our own life. And what does it mean to? And I feel you into this kind of like, okay, it really pulls me back, and how can I participate? But on the other hand, it also feels like as if really like diving into it is also in a way what spirals you back out, because it's like, okay, that's life, that's the dance, that's what we do. Mm-hmm. And then how can I do it with honor? And that makes a very different thing, because if I do it from a nihilistic perspective, so nothing mean anything, and like, like I just don't feel into it. So what helped you to kind of spiral out?
I would say I'm still in the gravity of that experience in some ways. I have this impulse to develop like political animism, this idea of like not left, not right, but what would an animist politics look like? And I'd say that's a lot of what I'm looking to develop. At the same time, because animism is based on negotiating of relationship, it's hard to take a position that there's anything out there that is not natural, right? Or that is like a death-driven thing. And I think Israel-Palestine is the most perfect test case. And I know there are real people on the ground there. I don't want to intellectualize it but like there's a way that because Greeks were the first to be converted to Christianity from the kind of followers of Jesus, like Greece and Greek Orthodox is kind of ground zero. And in many ways, it still resembles Judaism and animism the most within the kind of family of Christianity. And then it's like the further away you get from that, by the time you get to the Reformation, Christianity becomes this, colonizing empire thing that feels very death-driven, but at its roots, I can still connect to the animism. There's a way that monotheism, I feel like a similar trajectory where to me, Judaism feels like ground zero and is still very connected to animism and to place. And the further away you get, Christianity and then Islam, it feels like it gets further from a place, from context, right? I am honestly personally struggling to make sense of the impulse of Islamic fundamentalism and Hamas. Like I'm actively, it's the work I'm doing is trying to like, how do I understand these 1400 years of Islamic colonization and to understand how that also nourishes life? And to be honest, I'm having a hard time. And, I've studied the hell out of Christianity. I've come to terms with that. I can find the light in the shadow in that. I have my own relationship to that. There's something about Judaism to me that I really resonate because of how land-based and place-based it is. And I'm being honest. I look at what's happening in Israel and Palestine. I have many condemnations of, Israeli politics, the excesses of it, but I can understand in the context of Jewish history, the impulse to have one homeland for Jews, the impulse to convert everyone that you can come into contact with in terms of like fundamentalist Islam. I don't say Islam like religion, but fundamentalist Islam, that impulse to make everyone a Muslim and to disappear, to kill anyone who doesn't submit. I have a really hard time understanding that impulse. And that's my work, because it exists. Obviously, it's part of the universe. It's not for me to judge. This isn't natural. This shouldn't be here. But I do wish, at least here in the West, we grappled more with that history of Islamic colonization going back to the 7th century. And I'm sure it's genetic because I'm Greek and we were colonized and enslaved for 400 years by the Muslim Empire, by the Turkish Empire. So there's something ancestrally in me that also has like this, this familiarity with that energy, But I know depending where you are in Europe, that's what Christians were like for hundreds of years as well. So it's not to say Islam is some particular outside of nature, evil, demonic thing. It's more like, what is that impulse of monotheism that wants to make everything the same?
Is there any example for a religion that are not monotheistic and at the same time they are trying to replicate themselves.
No, there's really monotheism is like this very strange offshoot that developed. You have 1,000 different types of indigeneity and cosmologies and frameworks, like Vedic, like in India, Hindu, it's still an animist culture. There's many gods, but even my understanding, and I don't know how familiar you are with this, or if it rings true for you, is that all the names for God in Judaism were originally different gods.
Hmm.
So Adonai, Elohim, Yahweh, like these are actually ancient kind of tribal polytheistic gods that eventually kind of became
a god
consolidated, right, into one god.
It also brings me a question, like, why Judaism doesn't have this impulse of converting others. And I think it's because, I don't know, maybe because Judaism is some kind of a hybrid between ethnicity, tribalism, culture, and spiritual religious practice that also predates everything we know about religion nowadays.
Right.
But it still holds very similar perspective to Islam and Christianity. Yeah, no, I also, I have the same difficulty as you with this kind of very extreme expression of Islam. And I feel into what you're saying, that it's, on one hand, I feel like, like it's okay to practice having clear boundaries to ideas and say, look, these ideas are not welcome here.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's, and that's what I feel is happening. Like I moved from Israel many years ago, and I feel that this kind of this impulse, when you enact your boundaries, you take, it means you're in friction with that which you place the boundary with, no?
Mm-hmm.
And then there is a meeting point, and then there is like certain symbiosis in the boundary, and there is an exchange. And I definitely feel that, like, the Israeli culture is not how it used to be when I left Israel,
right,
16, 17 years ago.
Yeah.
But there's something that I want to dig into, because I didn't think about it before, and I would like you to expand maybe about like the connection to place, and why do you see it as such a significant thing in the sense of like, okay, let us say, like, Islam and Christianity somehow is like detached from place, and why, why do you think that it's such a significant thing to pay attention to?
Like, how do I answer this question? I think maybe because of my life experience and the stories that I've accumulated through history, there is something that happens when people and language and gods get detached from place. And it's happened, and it's happening, but I don't know why this is happening in the world. So I'm reserving judgment. I'm just saying, like, this is what I observe. So in Judaism, it's still a place-based religious framework, right? God appears on this mountain. The temple in Jerusalem is the center of it. It's this land. And as far as I can tell, also Judaism acknowledges that there are other gods. It's just this idea of this covenant, this contract between the God of Israel and his people, or its people. So it's still, like, in some ways, it's on, like, it straddles animism, because it's not saying there aren't other gods. It's just saying this is your God and this is the covenant that you've entered into. So it's a kind of contract. There's something about Christianity and Islam that doesn't acknowledge that there are other gods, that anything else that pretends to be a god is a demon or is not real. And that intolerance, that categorization for me is everything when you try to deal with modernity. I don't know why that happened, like, I don't know what the impulse in life is that would want to disappear all forms of divinity, all expressions of divinity other than one particular one of one particular people in one particular place.
Yeah. I don't know if your perspective on Judaism will hold water in the current culture in Israel, in the sense that there's many people who really anchor Judaism and understand Judaism as like, okay, something that is going away from paganism, and that it's clearly like, right, there's basic rules: don't make any shape or a statue, and like this is the one true God. But I think that if I think about it more from like the stories and the mythologies, and not from the, let's say, strict Orthodox religious rules, so then maybe yes, I think that then the Jehovah, Elohim, whatever you want to refer to, the Jewish God, is more presented as like the Alpha God, rather than okay, this is the true powerful God, and like, okay, you can believe in your Pharaoh can believe it, you can believe in your God, but then obviously when Moses will hit the stick, his stick will turn into a snake that will eat the other snake, because his God is just more powerful. So it's not about saying like, you don't have any magical powers and your God cannot do tricks, but ours is just simply stronger. Yeah. And I think that that's maybe what you're referring to, no? Kind of that. Those.
I agree, and it's almost like it's still a tribal cosmology, right? It's like a sports team. It's like, yeah, my sports team is the best one, and it'll beat your sports team. But it doesn't say that there aren't other sports teams, right? That there aren't other tribes, and I understand that's pretty normal. That's, yeah, at least in the Middle East, and from what I've studied, like it's just, yeah, you go into battle with your God against the other team and their God, and you battle it out. And the idea is that it's the God's will, you win the battle because your God was stronger. And that's where a lot of the reciprocity comes from. It's like, yeah, it's like a captain of your team kind of thing, but that's a very different thing from there are no other gods, there are no other teams on the field. And any team who tries to say they're a team, we're going to annihilate.
Yeah. I feel like that, if you're saying like that, it's hard, like I mean, I feel that, again, the impulse for me is like that, like, okay, let's say Christ, because Christ is a figure I can grapple with more than Muhammad.
Okay.
So, it's kind of a manifestation of, like the ultimate suffering, the person who can take the suffering of the world and transcend it into love and kindness, and there is something optimistic about it, saying like, okay, like, like that's something that can unite us. But I think that in the act of unification, there is an inevitable tyranny.
Yeah.
Because people don't want to be unified always. And then it's like, then it's a bit like, yeah, and it's an interesting question, because I've heard recently, there's the controversial psychologist Jordan Peterson that I really enjoy listening to his perspective about biblical text and how he makes sense of the stories. And he took the story of Exodus and Moses and as a story that comes to talk about leadership. And I studied it as a kid, because we studied the Jewish Bible in the high school. Even if it was not a religious school, we still learned it. And there is a moment that when Moses leads the people in the desert, and they're lost, and they are thirsty, and they ask for water. So he asks God to give him water. So he takes his stick, and God tells him, just go to this stone and ask for water.
Right.
And but he doesn't do it. He takes the stick and he hits the rocks, and the water comes. So God is still behind him. He enables him to give water, but then he bans him from entering the Holy Land. after he's been this miraculous guy who sacrificed his life for the Hebrew people, blah, blah, blah. And for one thing, he's out. And this is kind of like if the Holy Land is kind of representing, like the redemption. I don't know. So he said like, okay, no, when you use force, you don't get to the Holy Land. You cannot force the water to come out and still arrive to the Holy Land. And that's a very interesting perspective, because I do feel that, that the Christ as a figure is an important thing to have certain, like a northern star, like the Buddha, something we aspire to. But at the same time, the moment the idea comes that we should unify around this idea, then it's like, okay, then you're kind of, you're losing touch with leadership, with true leadership.
Yeah, these are really, really beautiful and really dense questions. I grapple with them a lot myself. I think my current understanding, it's funny because I think people just say monotheism and they say like, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Abrahamic tradition, I'll bet all three go back to Abraham. But for me, Judaism really stands apart in that, to me, it's a religion of protocol. It's a religion of practice. Meaning, like, to be a Jew is to follow these protocols that are part of this contract with God, this agreement. This is how you worship God. This is how you be a Jew. And it's Shabbat. It's all these different practices. That changes with Christianity, where Christianity and Islam becomes belief. It's almost like it doesn't matter what you do. You can be any kind of Christian as long as you believe in the resurrection of Christ and that there is one true God. There's not, you go to church, but there's nothing, you can be a Christian and have nothing to do with Christianity. It's all about belief. And so for me, it's a world difference, practice versus belief. And in some ways, belief allows monotheism to become universal. Whereas Judaism is still, it comes through the lineage of the mother. It's connected to something. I don't know the intricacies of converting to Judaism, to be honest. I'm curious about that, how and if someone is able to enter into that lineage if they're not born into it. And I wonder if that has always been that.
As far as I'm aware, and don't take me with a grain of salt because I'm not an expert of it, and I don't have anybody to shout now, hey, check this for us quickly.
Someone will.
So, but as far as I'm aware, it's a more of a new thing that had to be solved by Jewish rabbis in the diaspora, rather than like an inherited concept that was back then in the temple of the Israelites, no?
Yeah.
So back then it was just a tribal identity. It was like, okay, we are the Hebrew tribes and the Israelites. And nowadays you can convert by doing a very long process that is a bit like maybe it's a little bit like getting a citizenship in some European countries. Like if I want to get an Austrian passport, it's not enough that I've been living here. I need to show that I know the history, I'm speaking the language, and I have certain values in mind, and let's say I'm kind of anchored in a certain European perspective, and then I can get the passport. And I think that kind of becoming a Jew entails the same thing. It's definitely not like I take refuge in Buddha, I believe in Allah, Christ is my man, and that's it. Not at all. So as you say, it's like a process. And it's interesting, especially, I think it's a very interesting thing to hear people who converted to Judaism, because many people who convert to Christianity or Islam, I feel like it comes kind of as some kind of or I had a student of mine who grew up atheist and kind of became Christian, even though she's German, so definitely she was surrounded with Christian culture. And it's the language that I hear, and you also hear it around other religion, is some kind of a crisis of meaning, like that leads you into that. But when I hear people who converted to Judaism, it's mainly I hear people who say like, I just felt that I'm a Jew. There was something in me that was calling me to go there to this land and to these people, and something in me needed to go through this hardship.
Yeah.
Because it's not like I'm adopting a set of belief and now like I have a meaning.
Right.
So it really requires a certain sacrifice. And that's interesting. I didn't think about these things. And
I think
in my mind before this conversation, I definitely placed Judaism in the same bucket of the other religions. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's funny that I don't identify as any of the three, but again, I identify as an animist, but I'm an animist who's like had to study everything about monotheism to understand these things. I mean, I'll give another really great example that, I mean, I remember reading these papers years ago. I don't know where things are at now, but in Eastern Canada, I believe it's the Micmac, there's been a ongoing process of getting legal status for a new tribes, because in Canada and in the United States, there's a lot of, it's very complex legally what it means for there to be legal recognition of a tribe or a people, and then what it means to be part of that tribe. And part of that is because a lot of tribes now derive their income from casinos, from gambling, because the tribal territory doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of the state. And so it's legal to gamble. And so for more and more tribes, they're actually becoming quite rich off of casinos, off of gambling. And then for most tribes, there's a protocol of dividing up the income among people that are part of that tribe. So in the past, it was like you're part of this tribe or you're not, it's your lineage. But now there's real economic implications for who gets to be part of the tribe and how many people, because the more people say, oh, I'm a Micmac, that means there's less income for the other people that are already in that category. So politically, legally, it's gotten really complex of who gets to say they're part of the tribe. And it's not just, I'm not saying it's all economic, but that's one of the things that's playing out. And so there's been a process in Canada where they said, okay, like for the next 5 years, you can submit documentation to basically get included as a member of this tribe that's being legally recognized. So there's that process, and it's a mess. It's so complex. Like, again, the legal thing. But again, you have the state, you have the Canadian state that is the one that's deciding, right, the protocols, the categories. At the same time, there are people of that tribe who recognize that they don't remember any of the stories or the ceremonies or the protocols that were given to them. There's just no unique way that's been given to them to connect to that place. And so I think they went to the Iroquois people who are neighboring tribe, and they said, do you give us consent to learn your songs, your ceremonies, your protocols, so that we can practice these and can make connection with this land for even just a few years until we can start to receive our own songs and ceremonies and protocols. And then, we'll stop yours and we'll have our own. And they agreed. So people have been doing that, and that's been happening where they're starting to get, their own songs, their own ceremonies. So I think the last thing I was just saying in terms of that example of this kind of the political layer and the relational layer, when I look at, this conflict in Israel-Palestine, which is really a question of like who belongs and who has the authority to belong and say who belongs there. They're stuck in a political framework, like a framework of category, right? Jews, Muslims, Israelis, Palestinians. And that's where, going back to your first question of, my own practice, what I do, that's where ceremony and ritual come in, because to me, those are the technologies of belonging and from a relational place. If I could snap my fingers, if I could be God for a day and be like, and stop the conflict there in the Middle East, I would be like, what are the shared songs, protocols, ceremonies that people can do together, regardless who you are, to actually honor and be in reciprocity with that place. And I know that's not really going to happen. There's so much animosity built up in history there, but yeah, it's like place is a practice, belonging is a practice, right? It's not a category. And at the same time, we need categories because we have things like, how do you divide up resources, right? How do you say who is us, who's this nation and who's not, right? Because I can't come where you are in Austria and get unemployment assistance or, healthcare because I'm not an Austrian citizen. So I think as long as we're divided up in categories, there's always going to be these political questions of how you allocate resources. And that's fine. It's, it's part of reality, but how we relate to a place, how we relate to ourselves and our ancestors is through ceremony and ritual. And that needs to be nourished. So in some way, maybe it's like Judaism and Christianity and Islam together actually kind of, between the protocol of Judaism and the kind of belief of Christianity, it's also that question of like permeability of who belongs and who doesn't. And how you negotiate those two tensions.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful point to wrap it up. So I don't want to overstep the time limits that you offered me with this podcast. So maybe you can just share how people can maybe find you or reconnect or connect further with things that you're offering. And I do feel like that we need to do a chapter 2 because there's a lot of things that came up that I think would be valuable to continue discussing. But I think for today, if you could share a bit with the listeners where they can find you and
Sure. Yeah. So I have profiles on Facebook and Instagram, Christos Galanis. I have my own website, christosgalanis.com. People are free to reach out to any of those mediums. And if you're up for it, I would love a round 2 because I think there's also even how you and I first connected and met, and around, a lot around social justice and identity politics and within our communities and the arts community. And I've really appreciated your voice out there in all this. I've, been watching you doing your thing, and the fact that you're actually hosting these dialogues with people where, not just Facebook comments, but actually being willing to invite people into these dialogues, I think is key practice. I think it's so important right now, to continue these open lines of communication and questioning. And so I would appreciate just getting to know you a little bit more, through our couple conversations now. And to be honest, just seeing you as a father, last time I think we spoke, just kind of seeing with your kids, and the fact that you're, underneath these little icons and these profiles, like, are real people with full lives and families and all these things. And it's a good reminder that even everything we're talking about, both Israel, Palestine, are real people with families and lives underneath this that we're talking about, and to still, to drop into that reality as well and not forget that.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your sensitivity and delicacy and your curiosity to make sense of the world. I think that is a very needed quality. So thank you for your time, and until our next conversation.
All right. Thanks, Matan.
If you want to see more precious and insightful moments, make sure to check our short clips playlist. To see longer interviews, check out the full episode playlist just below it. And to be notified for all future videos, click the subscribe button and don't forget to hit the notification bell. See you on the next episode.